So hello, Slush. Happy to be with you here today. I'm here with Juliet, who is a partner at Kleiner Perkins. She's been there for 15 years. It's one of Silicon Valley's oldest, most venerable funds. And in the course of her work, she helps Kleiner Perkins sort of do all this sort of accompaniment of startups and helping them grow, helping them start their boards, helping them sort of make it through common pitfalls that companies can run into. And in her time at Kleiner Perkins, she had a chance to work on with companies like Google, Amazon, Spotify. She got to know founders like Daniel Ek, who we saw here recently. So we're going to talk a little bit about what she has learned, what she does at Kleiner Perkins, and how she can help startups and founders avoid mistakes and create what Juliet likes to call high-value organizations. So I thought we'd start by just telling us what do you mean by high-value organizations exactly?
Well, first of all, Leila, thank you for having me. And I have to apologize for my voice. I was asked this morning at a breakfast if I'd been out doing karaoke all night. And maybe I should have done, because I ended up losing my voice. That's the problem of too much travel. So I hope that you can all hear me. High-value organizations, let's get behind the jargon of what that means. It means building a company that is going to be significant for the long term. Mm-hmm. There are lots of successful companies, but I think the aspiration of any founder, and I've had the privilege to work with many through my career, is to build a company that's going to stand the test of time. That doesn't just mean a financial outcome, but it also means allowing people to fulfill their hopes and dreams, to grow and learn in their careers. And that is something that I think any great founder strives for.
Okay. Well, how do you get a founder who's starting his company, it's maybe early days, to think about these big picture ideas like culture and mission? These are kind of big words, big ideas. And I imagine when you're building software, or designing your new product, that might not be the first thing they think of. So how do you encourage them to do that? And is it important from the beginning to do that sort of thing?
So as you think about culture and some of the themes that you've mentioned, this all comes down to people. And, I would submit that people are the currency that are going to build these organizations. You can have a great product, but you're not going to get to that product at scale without great people. And so I think that most founders recognize the importance of building a company with great values and culture, even before they meet me around the investment table. And so as I think about it and I work supporting a founder, I always start by saying, what's your mission for the company? What do you really want to achieve? If you look at any of the great companies, their mission statement is very succinct. Google, harnessing the world's information. Facebook, connecting everybody. And then you've got to be able to have the value statement. And if you look at many of the great companies, their values are very succinct. Be bold, be fearless. Uber has 3, Facebook has, I think, 7, Google has 10. The reason why I think it's important to get those set well and cleanly from day one is that as you go on your journey and you're moving so quickly, let's take Facebook as an example. You're going from 1,800 employees in 2010 to 1,200 employees last year. You've got to make sure that you continue to harness that culture, and setting that early, I think, is really critical.
But how does when companies go through that period of very fast growth, what role does Kleiner Perkins and the fund play in making sure they stay on track in terms of that mission or their ideals? Is it something that you do sort of on a regular basis?
We will play whatever role the founder wants us to play. And in some ways, some instances it will be more involved, and in some it will be less. This is the founder's company, and we're here to support them in that mission. And we really do care very much about that. So I can give you a great example. We have very proudly a new investment in a company based in Berlin called Go Euro. Mm-hmm. The founder is truly spectacular, Nurin Sham, and he is so curious about building a great organization, great value, great issues from day one. Because he's growing so quickly, he wants to make sure that he can leverage himself. And I will say this, and I saw it when I first joined Kleiner Perkins, the first 100 employees and that first management team are really going to set the tone for the future. So you have to get that right. You know, if you look at the Google founding team, the Facebook founding team, there's very little turnover in those teams over the first few years of time. Now, one could argue it's because also they were advantaged by fast-scaling companies, but getting those key hires right is really critical because it sets the tone for everything else.
And maybe to go on with the Go Euro example, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about what you sort of did with the founder to sort of help him through those initial stages? Maybe did you advise him at all about assembling his management team, or maybe the board, or what are the sort of key things that you went through?
What was a real joy for me is that, you know, before he even took our money, he wanted to understand how we could help him. And he wasn't just looking for dumb capital. He really wanted to have partners who were going to support him every step of the way. But Naren is really laser focused. He knows exactly what he wants. There is no question about who's in charge here. But you know, the way I liken it is, listen, if we can help him mitigate risk, if we can save him time, if we can be the sort of the rifle shot that allows him to advantage that hire, that's important. I'm the same with thinking about his board of directors. That will be a journey, and it's one that I witnessed Daniel Ek go on over the years. Daniel has a superb board of directors. He was very careful and deliberate about what he wanted, very much reflective of how he was as a CEO. I look at him hiring Ted Sarandos, who's the number 2 at Netflix, onto his board, who I think has been in the whole Netflix relationship, which has been so valuable to him. And so this I view as a long-term journey, and that is what I think is important, is having founders that recognize the importance of people, own it, can layer that down within their organization. Some of the best CEOs I've seen will continuously spend 25 to 50% of their time on hiring. And it depends on which point they are in the scale up. But even when they're running large organizations, they're still intellectually curious about meeting the best and brightest in new areas. Don't call it recruiting, call it networking. This is about thought leadership in different areas. And I think that approach really allows people to continue to learn and grow.
Well, how do you when you're advising companies that are starting to get big about sort of who to have on their boards? I mean, boards also have to play a pretty important corporate governance check to make sure that the company's on track, that they're not burning cash in a reckless way. I mean, there is also sort of that control function, which some of it is played by the venture capital representatives on the board. But how do you kind of make sure that the board is sort of influential enough to play its role?
Well, this is a really loaded subject. So thank you, Leila, for going there. I would say this. I mean, let's distill down, certainly in the United States where I sit, and I know it's certainly different in Europe, but in the United States, the board has really 2 functions. It's to hire and fire a CEO, and it's fiduciary responsibility. Outside of that, there's nothing. And so I think what is really important is for a CEO, and particularly for a founder CEO, over time, to surround themselves with people who are going to add to the discussion. So I look at companies that I admire that are founder-led, you know, Google and Amazon being the 2 that I work most closely with. And Larry and Sergey were very clear that they wanted to add academic experience to push them intellectually and experientially, in addition to operating experience and investment experience. And so the same with Amazon. Jeff has a relentless focus on the customer and curiosity. But if you look at someone like Patty Stonecipher, who's been on his board for 19 years, he was very careful about the journey that he went on. So it is a long-term journey, but make no mistake, the founder is very clearly in charge, which brings me to the second issue that you touched on, which is something that we're debating a lot right now, which is dual class of stock, and maybe even 3 classes of stock. I think this is a reflection that the founders are very much the company. And I think that as people look to this, I hope that they will understand you're investing in an Evan Spiegel at Snapchat. And the success and the culture of the company rests on Evan. And yes, other people, but that's why these founders are so centrally important. But I will say this, dual class stock has been around for eons.
Yeah.
You've got media companies.
It's used by family owners.
Berkshire Hathaway. That is nothing new. I think what is new, the debate and the message is being confused, is that founders want to control their boards. I think evolved founders want to surround themselves with great people. And by the way, that also involves getting venture capitalists off your board when the time is right.
Yeah, it's interesting because hopefully we're going to see some big IPOs soon, maybe Spotify, maybe Snapchat in the coming months or in the next year. And the issue of sort of having different classes of stock, I think it can make sense to protect the founder and sort of really, make sure that the company keeps its identity. And Facebook has been very successful from that. But part of me also wonders whether once a company matures, if it starts to be a negative or a disadvantage. And I would argue maybe, or at least ask the question, that Facebook is so much Mark Zuckerberg's company that he rules everything. Meaning that so for maybe if you take like the fake news question that's come up after the U.S. election. Was he maybe myopic to that, or maybe not as focused on it because he's not being questioned internally? I mean, is that something that you think in the tech community we need to think about in terms of those dual class structures, or maybe do they lose their relevance after a certain number of years?
I think again the question comes: don't confuse the structure of dual class stock with a founder-controlled company, which is very different. Any great founder, and you mentioned Mark, I mean, he's a brilliant founder, surrounds himself with great people, and he selectively listens to what they have to say and opine. And so the issue I have, honestly, is with just weak boards, episodic boards, or boards that are not well thought through. And unfortunately, it's interesting, having started my business career in the United Kingdom and spent the last 20 years of my career in the States, I find that boards in Silicon Valley tend to be an afterthought. And I actually like the fact that these companies are being very thoughtful about their stock structure and their boards of directors, and they are going out and recruiting exceptional people. A big issue right now that I see is that so many people don't want to serve on boards of private companies because they take a lot of time. They don't pay out, most of them, to the degree that you would think. And I worry about that for young entrepreneurs. I want to make sure that if you're a great founder, you can have access to the best boards of directors that can support you in your journey.
That's interesting. Maybe you touched on the issue of talent, which is such a big one in Silicon Valley and everywhere really in tech. One of the kind of ongoing conversations in our industry in the past year or so, maybe a little bit longer, has been one of diversity. And kind of trying to bring in people from different backgrounds, more women, more minorities into tech land, right? How do you try and kind of move the needle on this issue? I know it's very complicated, it's not something you can sort of change overnight, but what have you guys done at Kleiner Perkins to try and make progress on this?
So we care about this issue very much, and Leila, you and I are going to be talking about this, I'm afraid, for 10 years to come, because until we get to parity, this is still a topic that should be talked about every day. And what worries me a little bit is so much has been said that I don't want people to lose their attention, their issue on this. So we've got to come up with new ways to move the needle. What have we done at Kleiner Perkins specifically? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we track the number of female founder entrepreneurs that we meet with. We track the number of CEOs that we back. We've got some exceptional women in our portfolio. Jen Hyman from Rent the Runway, Demet Moltu from Trenduol. These are really exceptional people, and we celebrate them. We formed a program called the Kleiner Perkins Women Leaders Program, which really gives access to networks to incredible women. We ensure that every event we put on, 50% diversity. And we have a Kleiner Perkins Fellows Program, which attracts the best and the brightest students who are doing their summer internship, and I'd very much like to bring it to Europe. And we have a requirement that actually we're pretty close to hitting. We were 42% last year. I'm hoping that we'll be at 50% this year, and that is without any degradation in quality. And so we talk about it constantly, all the time. I also really believe in the statement, I think, that Madeleine Albright said, which is, sort of there's a special place in hell for women that don't help each other. And I think we all as women have to remember that. And I'm always struck by people like Diane Green at Google, who whenever I call her to ask her if she'll join a women's dinner, she will absolutely make the time to do that.
That's good to know.
And by the way, all you men out there, we need you too, because you're fathers of daughters or you've got sisters, so don't think that this is just our problem.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, Kleiner Perkins also obviously went through a pretty painful process with a discrimination case in the US from one of the partners a few years ago. I imagine you guys must have learned lessons from that. So what can you tell us sort of about what changed maybe after that, or what sort of may have, how the thinking evolved within the firm after what was quite a painful episode, I imagine?
It was extremely painful, and it's extremely painful for me as a woman who has enjoyed a very great career, mentored by a lot of great men, including two in particular. One, Bill Campbell, who sadly is no longer with us, and my partner, John Doerr. But I will say this, that case did not have any bearing on the programs that I've just discussed. We've always done that. That case was unfortunate. It was decided by a jury, but for us, diversity, social justice has been, always will be, and unfortunately, you and I are going to be talking about it for a very long time.
For a long time. Okay. I guess the other thing that we talked about earlier was sort of this idea of trying to foster leadership at the companies, and you know, how do you help a CEO evolve? And I'm not sure if some of you were here when Daniel Ek was speaking, but one of the remarks he made that I thought was interesting was kind of how he grew as a CEO, how he initially thought HR was boring and then realized it was really important. So how do you sort of, what are the flags maybe when you notice that maybe one of your founders is not on the right path with this sort of thing, and how do you correct it sort of gently, or sometimes maybe not so gently? I mean, are these the sort of things where the relationship can handle those periods of difficulty, and is that part of your job?
As an investor, it is, obviously. And at the same time, as you know, once you put money in and back an entrepreneur, if you're on the board, you have a limited role. And that's why a relationship is really important. And so the way we tend to do it is this. It's about frequent communication and dialogue. You know, I could sit here and tell you that, you know, annual performance reviews and 360s are good, and they are, and they have a really important place, and they have an important place in a company that scales. But the reality is, it's me being able to sit down with the CEO and say, how are you doing? And let's really understand what's going on here personally and professionally. Where are you scaling? Where are you not? How can we support you? Who can we introduce you to on this journey that is a fellow CEO? And I'm always very struck by the willingness of people like Daniel and others to truly mentor, you know, people like Naren Sham, and just give time in a very great way. And I think you know, as we talked about women looking out for each other, it's the same founders looking out for each other. We have to pay it forward. One of the things I think is really important is less about the company's sort of performance, because that's easier to see, but it's more about, are you taking enough risk? And that was the lesson I learned from watching the early days of Amazon, which when I joined Kleiner Perkins, the stock was incredibly depressed. You know, this is 2001. I spent a lot of time with Jeff helping him think about the leadership team and helped him hire a CFO. But through all of that, he was so bold. They did a $100 million debt offering that honestly saved the company. And so keeping that boldness and fearlessness when it's so easy to retrench and be conservative, to me, is absolutely critical.
That's great. Well, listen, Juliet, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time, I guess.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.